Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 3. I want to thank you all for the really interesting papers that you've been submitting so far. I want you to know that we've had almost universally excellent papers, and really appreciate also the fine work that you've been doing in the discussion section. So want to encourage you. We're halfway through with this week, so keep up that good work. I know we're coming up to the last month here of your last summer before college, so I know it's tempting to just sort of spend that totally relaxed, but we really do appreciate all that you've been putting into the class. Hopefully you're getting a lot out of it as well. And we have another really excellent week lined up for you this week. Hopefully you're seeing not just the connections between the various speakers in any given week, but you're starting to make some of those connections across the weeks. And that's really what we hope, we anticipate what your college experience should be like too, as you take courses within a given semester, having courses that might be from very different departments, on the surface studying very different things, but that hopefully you'll make really interesting connections. And then across semesters, both within your major, connecting all the various ways of understanding that discipline, but across the various departments, and you come away from college ideally with a very holistic understanding of the world. We often seem to be doing very different things as professors, but when we get talking and when we experience the same thing, we're like, oh, that's so cool. I can't believe you study that. I kind of study that in a different way, but we see those connections as well. And so hopefully you're starting to see that too. This week, our title is Reproductions and Machine Consciousness. And I think it's also fascinating, especially given what's happening in the world. But I think you're going to be especially interested to see how that topic is illuminated by our various professors who are presenting here. And I'm going to just start us off by handing the reins over to Dr. Malecki, who's going to start us off with a very, very interesting talk this morning.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And of course, I was working on sharing the audio, and now my share screen is not working, but that's okay because I'll just talk while I'm doing that, and it's going to be great. But yeah, my name's Jeff Malecki, and I teach in the music department. I teach band and courses in both music education and a few other areas, our music teaching and learning, among others. All right, here we go. Sorry about that, friends. And I'll also give another apology. As I was walking in the Camino Hall this morning, there was a sign in the door that said they were going to be doing fire alarm tests from 10 to 4. So hopefully we can make this all work. But yeah, here we are. So like I said, I teach the band here and some music teaching and learning classes, music and film, and I'm teaching a summer course, American music. So with a couple of those courses in particular, I've started to look at hip hop a little bit more and how we digest that as a society. And I think there's some interesting things very currently that all tie into this. I wanted to start by giving a little bit of a background. And as we were logging on today, why on earth were we listening to disco? If anyone is either old or has older tastes, that was Donna Summer. And the reason disco is pretty important, disco was the main thing in the 1970s. And up until the 1970s, you would use live musicians, you use acoustic musicians, if you had any means to do so whatsoever. That was the best thing to do, whether it was a classical setting or a rock band setting or any type of live music. You wanted live musicians. Disco made a turn there, and then house and EDM music really made a drastic turn because they started using these electronic sounds willingly, and they said, actually, this is kind of cool. Let's try taking this and looking at it in different ways. So now we see technology, certainly not AI at this point, but technology working its way into music significantly more than the last few centuries before that. Of course, hip hop's going to be incredibly important as we talk about AI produced pop songs, partially because, again, with the electronic sounds, not only are we using electronic instruments like a turntable in a different way, but we're starting to use sampling and things like that. Now, in the early days of hip hop, which would actually started in the late 70s, moving into the 1980s, The hip hop artists on the streets of the Bronx aren't going to be getting legal copywritten permission to use these samples. It would have just been used at a block party on the street and no one would have really cared. It would have been mainly consumed live. So using someone else's music would have been kind of accepted in that general arena. Sorry, as we get into the certainly the 1980s and definitely the 1990s, we start hearing auto-tune. So now at this point, the computer systems are actually going in, listening to just the audio file of the main melody or any specific voice that you decided to choose. But in 1998, our good friend Cher, who certainly would have known a little bit about these electronic sounds from the disco era, she decided to, in the 1998 song Believe, very clearly auto-tune her voice. So she wasn't hiding it. If we played the video, which we won't for right now, it's really great because we see this kind of futuristic music video, and whenever her voice is distorted with auto-tune, her image is also distorted. But she embraced that auto-tune, that really electronic type sound, and said, hey, we're going to use that. And that was in 1998. That wasn't that long ago. I know it was before most of the students here were born, but that said, now it's just something that we normally hear in a certainly hip hop tune, R&B, rock. Auto-tune is so mainstream. And then I'll also mention that GarageBand is an Apple app that started in 2004, I want to say, 2005. And GarageBand started as a kind of a music, you can input things, you can mix things. It's a great tool now for DJs. It's come a long way since 2004. But more recently, in 2000, I want to say 12, the accompanying app called Music Memos really, again, started to test the waters between just regular old, what are we doing with electronic sounds, and AI. When you opened this Music Memo app, that was actually discontinued just in the last few years, which was really too bad. All you got was this wonderful middle screen that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie, and you would press that button and you would record yourself singing or playing guitar or just doing one thing. The app would figure out what chords probably went with your song. It would figure out what bass line would probably go pretty good with your song. It would figure out what beat would go with your song. And, is it more of a duple feel or more of a triple feel? And here's a drum set that goes with your song. So it was invented for songwriters who are maybe more on the amateur side. Or I want to say this was originally a collaboration with Sting, who said, sometimes I just wake up in the middle of the night, I have a tune in my head, and I just need to record it really quick and figure something out like that. So it's a way to do that, basic melodic recording, and then have the computer figure out how a song would kind of build around that. So we fast forward now to 2013. Congratulations, everyone in this room is probably alive. And this is where we have the song Blurred Lines that come out in 2013. Now, at this point, we're not really talking at AI at all, but we're going to put a pin in this conversation and talk about how music and kind of ethics and law can all come together. So 2013, it's Robin Thicke, Pharrell Williams, and T.I. Pharrell Williams ends up writing 65% of the song, or so they say, in a courtroom. You have to come up with numbers like that. And they're sued in 2015 originally, by the Marvin Gaye estate. Now, Marvin Gaye died in 1984, but his estate said, you know what, this is a whole lot like our song, Got to Give It Up from the 70s. You can't do that. And both in 2015 in the original case, and then in 2018, both of those courts, both of those judges or judge panels ruled with Marvin Gaye's estate, saying, actually, this is too close to Marvin Gaye's song. You can't do that. You're wrong, Robin Thicke and Pharrell. Now, how did they come to that decision? Now, when I usually talk to my intro 100 level music classes, whether it's music and film or American music, we talk about how we're going to talk about music. What are the main categories? That kind of how you talk about music and culture all together is very often under the umbrella of what we would call musicology or a musicologist, even though that's not necessarily my main discipline. But we all kind of stick our feet in the water. So we would talk about what the melody is, that main part. Is it, does it have a big range or a small range? Is it more conjunct or disjunct? Does it move around a lot or not? What about the harmony? How do the supporting notes go together? Is it more major and happy sounding or minor and sad sounding? What kind of rhythm is it? Duple, triple? Is it a faster rhythm, a slower rhythm? And how do we know that? Like, what is the drum set pattern that goes with it in a pop tune? And then that last tune, it's timbre, not timber. We're not chopping down any trees at this point. Timbre are the actual instruments that are going together to make this sound. So in a standard rock tune, you would have guitar and bass and drum set and vocals, maybe a keyboard, maybe some supporting percussion, pretty standard stuff there. And we talk about those. So in this court case, they actually brought in two musicologists, two dueling musicologists here. I love that because musicologists are usually pretty tame. But the Marvin Gaye estate brought in Judith Fennell, who's actually a professor, just like a few of us are. She teaches at UCLA and has this law business. She's a forensic musicologist, which actually I didn't know existed until I did some research here. But Dr. Fennell's jumping off point was that the feels of these two tunes are the same. And that's a little bit tricky because if a student in my 100 level class said the feel of this is blah, 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 I would say, yeah, that's fine. But tell me specifically how you got to that conclusion. And a 100 level student at USD ends up being able to do that after one of my classes, actually probably after a month of one of my classes. Telling me about what the melody's doing and what the harmony's doing and what the rhythm and timbre are doing. Now, she didn't just say that. She also said there's a theme X that's a 4-note melody that is shared in both tunes. Well, okay, so those 4 notes are the same in both pieces. That seems to make some sense. Both have a bass part that descends in kind of an interesting way. Like, okay, there's some overlap there. She said there was a use of unusual percussion. She said the unusual percussion was cowbell. I know when I think of cowbell, I think of the old Saturday Night Live sketch where they're saying more cowbell. Is cowbell unusual at this point? I don't know. And then background party noises. If you watch the video to Blurred Lines, it's this slightly dated, weirdly misogynistic and uncomfortable party where Robin Thicke is doing his Robin Thicke frat boy thing. Nothing against frat boys. But it's, kind of, they're all just having this dance party. So there's, woo, hey, dance party sounds in the background. And Judith Fennell said that's unique to both the Gaye original song and the Pharrell song. Sandy Wilbur comes in. She's from New York and it does just law and musicology. And she says, actually, I disagree with Dr. Fennell. First of all, and pretty significantly with that, with the law framework, is that copyright in this case only applies to the written piece. So if I write a piece and want it copywritten, I write it down, I send it off to the Copyright Office, and they say, yes, you have copyright. That's not the same as the audio recording. Because if let's just say I write that piece and I'm in the studio, and then all of a sudden I know that Dr. Peterson can sing some mean backup vocals. So we add her in last minute and she rocks it. It's not in the original, but now it's in that recorded version. Well, Dr. Peterson's vocals are not copywritten since they're not in that. But she also says of those 5 things that we listed there, and there's a larger list than that, those aren't that unique to Marvin Gaye's song. Cowbell is in a bunch of songs. Even that 4-note little melody, it was kind of cherry-picked in the middle, and it's in a bunch of songs. And she said, actually, listen to Superfly by Curtis Mayfield. It's in that song, and that was written, I think, in 1972. It was written before the Marvin Gaye song. So she said, from that logic, you could sue Marvin Gaye for stealing someone else's music before that. And we see this kind of recurring pattern there. So how did this all boil out? We kind of already said Marvin Gaye's estate won. The Pharrell and Robin Thicke ended up having to pay around $5 million and half of all the future royalties for the song. So it's a pretty significant win. I guess they probably have more money than I do. $5 million is a lot. Of the 3-judge panel, it was a 2-1 decision, and one judge, Judge Jacqueline Wen, she actually dissented, and she said, this is the first time that we're trying to copyright a musical idea, or that idea of feel that first musicologist talked about. That's kind of broad, and what is feel? Can we actually quantify it? She said there's legal precedents that ideas are protected, but not the expression of ideas. She said clapping in a song is an idea, but then how do you express that clapping? Is it fast clapping? Is it a clapping in a special pattern? Is it something that really makes clapping unique in your song? That part is protected. Is not protected. And then she said the broader implications of this, music as we know it could just crumble, and everyone could be suing everyone saying, well, I've had band performances here at USD that maybe someone says, oh, that sounds a lot like the band at San Diego State. We're going to sue Dr. Malecki. Well, I would hope not, because I don't have that $5 million. But then the other judge panel actually came back after their original opinion and kind of had this counter dissent, scolding the original dissenter, Judge Wen, saying that this is a procedural appeal. It's just what we do. We're getting into the law weeds. We're not deciding that much stuff. So it's, I want you to realize that of the court cases of music and copyright, and eventually things like AI, these are contested very, very hotly, even in the legal community, certainly in the musical community. So here's where I'd like you to think about a few of these questions, and then I'm going to have you hop into the part of Zoom here where you can put reactions in, and don't do anything yet, but I'm going to want you to give me a little green check mark if you think everything's good, or give me the red X if you think things are bad. But based on everything we've talked about so far, is this Drake AI song legal? So in 2023, Ghostwriter 977, we don't really know who that person is, on TikTok released a song called Heart on My Sleeve by Drake and The Weeknd, and it went crazy. I believe there were over 11 million downloads. Everyone's like, wow, we didn't know Drake and The Weeknd were collaborating. This song is so great. After a day, it was swept down from everything, because Drake and The Weeknd said, well, we didn't do that. And the song's 100% produced by AI. We're going to listen to Drake's voice, and it's not Drake's voice. We're going to listen to The Weeknd's voice, and it's not The Weeknd's voice. Now, one of the problems with this is we don't know who Ghostwriter 977 is. We don't know what Ghostwriter actually did. There's a little conspiracy theory online that actually this is original Drake and he just wanted to be kind of more mainstream and forward. I don't think that's the case, but we don't know. Did AI actually write the song, which it's capable of doing, or did Ghostwriter do that? Did he write the song? Did he write the lyrics, or she, I should say? And then they just inserted those voices in. And then we, said what we talked about clapping there a little bit. Is this an idea, or is this more of an expression idea when we're thinking about those specific voices? What do you think is unique here between things like melody, harmony, and rhythm, all those things? Let's, assuming that we all haven't listened to this song, even though we have, I put it in our homework reading here. Let's listen to a little bit. If a few of my colleagues can give me a thumbs up if the audio is still working.
With my ex, like Celine, not a flex, ayy. Pumping Justin Bieber, but I think if I had left, ayy. She know what she need, but I need how she blessed, ayy. Give it my best, ayy. Got my heart, I'ma slay it with a knife. My back, with that, ayy. 21, I love him, that my brother, that's where stack, ayy. Metro made the beat, so you know that it's gon' slap, ayy. Yeah, it's gon' slap, ayy. Tough, run it back. Talking to a diva, she on my nerves. She think that I need her, kick her to the curb. All I know is you couldn't have the world. At the world, yeah, you want my love. These girls bring that up, these girls on my track. Like Selena, baby, on my cheating, baby, yeah. She can never would drop to the back door. And she white out the store.
So we'll pause it right there. So go ahead into the reactions tab at the bottom of our screen there. And I'm curious, let's see, again, if you think this use of Drake's and The Weeknd's voices are okay, give me the little green check mark. If you think it's not, let's do the little red square here. Switching over, I see a good amount of no's, but I see a couple yeses. Yeah, I'd say the no's have it by a pretty big margin. Well, that said, we're not done yet. Let's go on and get some opinions from kind of the ether, both arguments and counter arguments. Again, this is our own kind of little courtroom right here. So when that first came out, even though somewhat surprisingly, Drake and The Weeknd themselves stayed somewhat quiet when this came out. Drake especially has had plenty of other tunes. He's been caught up with AI and things before, and has his opinions out there. But due to the probably litigious nature of all of this, a statement was made by the Universal Music Group, which represents Drake and The Weeknd and a third of all the musicians out there. So we can see they said the training of generative AI using our artists' music begs the question as to what side of history all stakeholders in music, in the music ecosystem want to be on: the side of artists, fans, and the human creative expression, or on the side of deep fakes, fraud, and denying artists their due compensation. Not lightly put at all. The Universal Group says this is not good at all. You're stealing, you're fraudulent, you're fakes, and you're denying artists compensation. A lawyer was interviewed, again, a music lawyer dealing with copyrights and music, in an interview in Vice. He brought up a little bit more specifically here, how was Drake's body of copyrighted work used to train the AI? So he started to talk about, like, actually how would they sue if and when they do. Consider the name, image, likeness, and right of publicity around the publication of the resulting work, and whether it inappropriate trades on Drake's existing rights and his brand. So along these lines, you could say, this song is fine. It doesn't say anything particularly bad or anything like that. But at the same time, what if you used Drake's song or Drake's voice to make statements that were racist, or for one political candidate or another political candidate that Drake didn't agree with? So that's where we're starting to get a little bit more specific. However, there are actually quite a few arguments on the other side. In 2006, Joanna Demers wrote a book. She's a musicologist who teaches at USC. Of course, Hollywood and LA being kind of a hotbed for certainly law, but also the music industry. She actually wrote a book, again, a while ago, called Steal This Music: How Intellectual Property Law Affects Musical Creativity. And she says, I'm concerned about the fad of transformative appropriation, the creative process by which artists and composers borrow from and respond to other musical works. So she's saying this transformative appropriation, that we should be more open with things, because as we see they're kind of going into hip hop exists because of sampling and scratching and using other people's music. Now, she also goes on in her book to talk about how compensation would work, but she says we should be open with this and just kind of put our artwork out there. We say we created it, here it is, use it however you think you need to. The pop artist Grimes, the song came out, I believe, on April 4th or so. So shortly after that, on April 24th, on Twitter, along with several other artists here. We can read her quote as well. She's saying, hey, I think you should use my voice. We'll split the royalties. It'll be great. There's kind of a thought that if Dr. Turrell is actually a really great songwriter, but no one knows because he's stuck at USD here, doing smart person political science law things. He could write all the best songs in the world and no one would know. But if he could actually use Grimes' voice in one of his songs and get it out there, now people might actually listen to it. And now Dr. Turrell could be like, oh, well, hey, now I'll split 50% of the royalties with this really great song with Grimes. So there are a few arguments there and counter arguments. So I wanted to go right back to this other slide. And after thinking about certainly some of the counter arguments, since most of us were saying no, I wonder if anyone's opinion has changed. Could you go back into the expressions here? This I will end, but also certainly talk more as we go into our discussion groups later. Answer the exact same question one more time. Do you think this song is okay? A yes with the green, a no with the red, and I'm going to be curious to see if anyone's opinions have changed with those other two bits of information. I see a few more greens. Interesting. All right. So I wanted to end it right there, and I look forward to discussing this in more detail in our at the end of our class and in our discussion groups.
Excellent. And who are we passing it on to next, Dr. Malicki? Because I know we had
It's me,
bit of wonderful.
Dr. Trull, yeah. Hey, everybody. My name is Dr. Amanda Peterson. I am a professor of Spanish and Latin American Studies. I also, some of you guys might have seen me around and you're preparing for first year stuff because I spend a whole lot of time preparing for y'all to arrive to campus and to coordinate all of our efforts to get scheduled and in LLCs and all sorts of stuff. So I'm always delighted to be able to get a bit of time with y'all before you're on campus, and we've been preparing intensely all summer for your arrival, and we just can't wait. Today, I am going to talk about Jorge Luis Borges, and he is a short story author and a poet and an amazing, he was an amazing kind of literary philosopher. And what he would write about is so many things that have to do with exactly the things that we're worried about right now with AI, with what is originality, a lot of what Dr. Malecki was talking about of like legal reasoning of originality, what is actually copy, what is original, what is production. He would be so fascinated and probably super worried, to be honest, about what would be happening. So I think I'm really thankful for the story this time to go back to Borges, because I hadn't read him in a long time. I definitely hadn't read him in English probably ever, since I'm a Spanish professor. When these texts were assigned to me, they were in Spanish. And so it's a lot of fun for me to come in. So I want to talk we're talking about originality on creation and failure. So this is a picture of Jorge Luis Borges. Most of the pictures that you see of him are him as an elder statesman of the literary creation world. And my favorite ones with him are when he's talking to cats, and you can just tell he kind of looks at them with this like curiosity. But the picture I wanted to kind of show you all is of Jorge Luis Borges when he was 22. So this is not too far off from how old y'all are, not too far off from how old I was the first time I sat down and read Borges myself. And he was a young, timid man, they say, and he was growing up in a time where the world had lots and lots and lots of anxieties about technology, about its impact on the world. Right, and when he was about this age, the US had survived a First World War. We were undergoing all sorts of industrial revolution, and there were so many questions, not dissimilar from what's happening now, of what would be the importance of humans, what would be our contributions now that the machine was going to take over all our lives, and if we were able to have any kind of thoughts about intellectuality, about what it means to be human, how humans think, how humans produce. It's really fascinating to see how this is not just a brand new thing that is coming up because of ChatGPT or because of AI and all of our kind of worries about this sort of thing. So that was one of the reasons why I really wanted to participate in this, because I thought, oh gosh, there's so many moments in history where we have been having an intense anxiety about technology, and we're truly afraid of what the repercussions might be. So the book that is his most famous literary book is Ficciones. It's a short story collection. It was published in 1941 and again in 1956. Note that there are two publication dates, same short story collection, which is very much a play on what's in the content of the book. You'll see I'm peppered as many pictures of him with cats as I could, because I find it just so fascinating. But you'll see, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the covers that have been used over the years for this collection, but you'll see that you kind of have this like labyrinth here. And so I want you to kind of think about what a short story collection that might be introduced by the concept of a labyrinth might bring to us. So yeah, how could a book be published both in 1944 and 1956? So super fascinating. There's a book, it's a different book. It's not an entirely different book, but it has a few different short stories. There's some changes to some of the text. And the prologue to the second 1956 edition and all the subsequent editions played so much with our sensibilities of what is real, what's not real, what's fiction, what's made up, what's a copy. And the prologue, the narrator actually just tells us, it's like, okay, so this one totally made up, not real at all. This one, like actually true, but totally a lie. This one, a complete new universe, but this is actually fact. I have all the documents to prove it. So he plays with all of these things that you think, oh, this is legit, I can understand this, but then he starts explaining that it's another universe that doesn't exist, and so he immediately thrusts you into questioning what originality is, what the world and the universe in which you're in is, and what the fictions are being created in here. Oftentimes when we're talking about literary structures, we will talk about a Chinese box structure or a Russian doll structure, that you have a box within a box, or a doll within a doll within a doll, and they're infinite. You can't tell where they begin, where they end. He was the absolute king of doing this in his literary moment, and even now today. So some of the, and then you can put this in chat, and I just got some of the most interesting covers that I could find over the years of this short story collection. So if there's anything that immediately comes up to you, put it in the chat as like, what might this be about? If you were to see this on the bookshelf, would you be like, oh, weird? Or wow, I'm super fascinated. What might you think? Does anything immediately come to mind? Yeah, like it could be about thinking or the brain. Great. Question the reality of the world. Awesome. Thanks, Ava and Tatum. Trying to get a sense of containment, like everything seems kind of wild. Thanks, Caitlin and Ava and Tatum. It's totally trippy, right? It might be on some sort of other plane, asking who we are in the world, and someone else in a direct message just said, like, diving deep into who we might be or who we are as people in the world, escaping reality, like birth and creation. I think that's a really good observation. Definitely some dystopian kind of things in here. This is an awesome list, y'all, by the way. Super, super good. And I think, we could, if we wanted to, spend an entire discussion session this afternoon talking about one or two of these images. But there's a lot of kind of things that we think about in terms of dystopia, right? What is our world? Where's our universe? Kind of this unsettling of the world and not knowing what is real or what is. Certainly a questioning of reality and brain and thought and perception. And then also, I think it's really perceptive to look at that picture on the right of, like, it looks like kind of creation or birth. And just you all are mentioning lots of things about complexity, the power of the mind, the importance of the mind, the importance of, I would venture to say as a professor, critical thought and critical analysis. One of the things that I do, I'm sorry, there's a tape in there, as a literary and cultural studies professor, is that I ask these questions when I'm walking around, and I start wondering, and I go in kind of random tangents in my brain, wondering what possibly could be going on with this little detail that I might never have noticed before. So when we talk about, so I'll just give you a couple different ideas of some of the things. I mentioned the prologue. Another short story that is really famous and always has made me chuckle so hard is, it's called Pierre Menard, the author of Don Quixote. For those of you who don't know, Don Quixote is a well-known canonical work from, like, I don't know, I would have to say like 1630 something. And the entire story asks this philosophical question: what would happen if an author, this one named Pierre Menard, happened to write the exact same work of the Quixote, word for word, exactly as it had been written 400 years ago? Would it be deemed more original, less original? How could it possibly be anything but original, even if it's written exactly as it had been 400 years ago? And is it more uncanny and spectacular that he wrote it 400 years ago about a time that happened 400 years ago? Or what? Those are all the questions that the narrator leads us through. And by the way, this is one of the ones the narrator insists to us over and over, that he's talked to the author, that he's seen the text, and he insists in the actual materiality and proof of the reality of the short story. Yeah, there's other couple of short stories that are super fascinating in terms of imagining what the structure of knowledge is, what the structure of society, when it's called the Library of Babel. And also, it asks a lot of philosophical questions, like if we were to center our field of knowledge around a completely different subject than what we have done that in the past, how would our world completely change into something that we can't imagine? And I think a lot of y'all are mentioning things like dystopian or kind of like alternating realities. And this is because we see lots of fictions nowadays, and especially in like Netflix, super popular right now, all sorts of speculative dystopian narratives about, like This Is Us, about contagion and almost the end of the world. We have so many references of that in our lives, which I think is personally amazing. But sometimes we're so used to it, we don't always question all the realities that are being presented to us. So the short story that I really wanted to talk to you about today is called The Circular Ruins, and it is one of my all-time favorite stories of Jorge Luis Borges, which is saying a lot. And I also have to admit that I had not gone back and read the entire collection of short stories since probably when I was in grad school, which is quite some time ago. So it was a delight for me to go back and read them, but also to return to the Circular Ruins, which has been always my favorite text. And there are a couple of things that stood out to me, and some of them have to do directly with what we're talking about here in terms of anxiety around technology, what's originality, what's creation. But there was one thing that I couldn't not mention here, especially to a whole bunch of first years who are about to embark on a huge life change in their life, is that there is so much emphasis on this in his failure. He understood the initial failure was inevitable. And almost all of the story, until it has like a twist at the end, describes in how many different exceptional ways he fails over and over and over with his goal, which is coming on the next slide. So he understood that the task of molding the incoherent and dizzying stuff that dreams are made of is the most difficult work a man can undertake. He understood that initial failure was inevitable. And I love this so much because a lot of times what happens in our kind of curated social media life is that we don't see all the tiny and big failures that lead to our successes. And so this was one of the first times I have read this short story through that lens of like, wow, this story is telling us not only how many times one has to fail in order to accomplish something, it's expected it has to be. The end of the story also kind of gives us a little bit of twist on that, but I will come back to that in a second. So there are a couple really good images of kind of like giving us what could be looking at these circular ruins be looking like. None of them look like what they might look like in my brain, by the way. So the other thing that I just really love about this, and I want for us to reflect upon, especially in this era of ChatGPT and AI, is it engages in the question of what is it to create? What is creation? So his endeavor, his dream was to dream a man. I also, as a side note, notice how male-centric the text is now when I'm reading it, because it's always a man. He wanted to dream him completely in painstaking detail and impose him upon reality. This magical objective had come to fill his entire soul. If someone had asked him his own name or inquired into any feature of his life until then, he would not have been able to answer. And I found that super fascinating there because for a couple of different reasons. One, the dream of creation is so complex and enthralling that there is nothing else. And it also shows how much painstaking detail how much effort and detail and slowness asked to be involved in the act of creation and thinking. Borges was obsessed with how the human brain kind of would process information, how would it organize information. And so for him to think of a man character of a man dreaming up another man, it was probably his like most beloved fantasy of someone imagining over and over and failing over and over to accomplish their dream, but to do it with such detail and precision. And you'll see kind of in this this image right here, there's kind of all of these little kind of beings that one's trying to get into the circular ruins, one is just kind of sitting there, one is watching, one isn't able to walk, and it's kind of making reference to all the failures of the dream of creation that we have going on here. And it's also kind of the circular ruins are within a brain. And I find this kind of super fascinating also if we were to think about what the structure of ChatGPT or of AI. I wonder if there might be a way that we could imagine kind of this ruinous structure, that there are different little pieces of information and narratives and knowledge that have been incorporated in, and all of them have a fracture and a brokenness and a failure in them. And that without that kind of like eye that is looking at the whole picture, we are able to see the fracture or the failure of those little pieces. So the other thing that I really wanted to think about and share with y'all is what we think about when we think about a translation. So I mentioned at the beginning that I originally, when I was probably around your age, read these short stories in Spanish for the first time. They're complex stories even in English as I read them now, and my Spanish is not the same. It's much more advanced than it was when I first was an undergrad reading these short stories. But it is a fascinating endeavor also to read a text by Jorge Luis Borges, who was so enamored and obsessed with what the idea of originality and copy and reproduction might look like in translation, because I think oftentimes those of us who are not in the literary field might just think that translation is almost like a plug and play, right? It's almost like a ChatGPT exercise that you put in a text and then out comes the output of what the text will look like. And it was as if it were just a mathematical equation. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's not how translation works. It's in particular not how literary translation works, but it is when literary translators are doing their work, it's sometimes in a team, sometimes in dialogue, but it is intense recreating of a work. And so I was thinking about that so much with Dr. Meleki's comments about how artists will use different pieces and recreate with different pieces. And while a literary translator is not rewriting a work on their own, they are rewriting and recreating different copies and versions and original ways of accessing these literary texts that without their input would be completely different. And if Dr. Smith were to sit down and do one of these translate a short story from French, it would not be the same way that I would translate it into Spanish. It's not only like a game of telephone, but it is something that both takes away and adds to the process of creation as it goes along. So I'm always fascinated when we have these kind of stories about like, legally, like what's original and what's not, and what's okay and where's the line, because in so many ways when we're talking about creation, literature, translation, and art, nothing is created in isolation and everything is in conversation with one another. We wouldn't exist in this way if we weren't doing these kind of things. So this brings me kind of to my last point, and I am delighted to be giving this lecture from Mexico City, where I've been doing some research that had to do with ruins yesterday. And I just was really, and I had been reading this text last week and walking around, and I just was impacted so much by this site, and I always am. But Borges really wrote, he believed that ruins, and one of the reasons why I love the short story is that he shows us that ruins gives us this visual representation of structures of power and systems of knowledge. And they're oftentimes a very visual way of showing us how prior cultures might have been erased or destroyed because in lieu of something that was perceived to be better, more powerful, more efficient, more just, more moral, more holy. And one of the things that I just absolutely adore when I'm able to walk into ruins, and especially in the middle of a huge, one of the biggest cities in the world, in Mexico City, and I'm able to see apartment complexes that were built in the 1960s with kids running all around, ruins that were last inhabited in about 1520 when the conquistadores were already in the city, and then a church that was built a few decades after that first battle. So if you come to my discussion group, I will also tell you about some very surprising circular ruins that I found yesterday in a moment of magic that I was not expecting from ruins. But I will end with these pictures of Borges. And one of the things that is also fascinating about him is he always had little, there was always almost always a cat in many of his short stories. And the appearance of a cat will often hint to a shift in world and universe. And so not only is it really cute to see all these sassy cats kind of interacting with a very important literary figure, they're also just a symbol that are amazing to kind of see for us. So that is it. Thank you so much for, I'm going to see if I can stop sharing. Did I stop sharing? I did. No. Yes. Okay. It's weird. We have all forgot how to teach on Zoom. I think this is a good thing. And then I believe next, we're going to Dr. Holtzman.
All right. Well, thank you to my colleagues for such fascinating presentations. I will, I think, pick up on some of the same threads here in talking about AI and cinema. I'm Hannah Holtzman. I teach in our film studies program. We have a film studies minor at USD. I do teach a course on AI and cinema, kind of narratives, representations of AI, and how we develop our ideas about AI from the movies. But this talk today is going to focus a bit more on a really contemporary moment and thinking about how AI is used as a tool and as a disruption in cinema today. So let's see. Okay, brief overview. We'll start with a little bit of historical context, thinking about what was cinema, how has it traditionally been conceived. We'll talk briefly about the many deaths of cinema and how each of these is usually kind of prompted, or the declaration of the death of cinema is oftentimes prompted by a new technological development. And then the majority, I hope, will focus on AI and sort of what we might talk about as a new kind of cinema. All right, so what was cinema? This is going to be film history in 2 minutes here. But thinking about the introduction of cinema in the 1890s was really, people didn't think about cinema as an art form, as an entertainment form. It was really more about this introduction of new technologies. So Thomas Edison introduced the kinetograph, which was kind of recording camera, and the kinetoscope, which was a separate machine that allowed for people to view films just one at a time. And then in France, the Lumiere brothers created the cinématographe, which kind of combined these two technologies in one. But these films were very different, right? They were very short. The Lumiere brothers films, for example, were just 50 seconds. And they were kind of just seen as like a carnival trick, amusement, a kind of cheap form of entertainment. Here you can see a parlor featuring the kinetoscopes, right? Where people would go and watch one for a few pennies. And it wasn't really until a couple of decades later, early 20th century, that people began to think about cinema as an art, right? People were experimenting with different ways of editing film. So here you see Sergei Eisenstein, a Soviet filmmaker and theorist, who thought about how can I create narrative? And of course, he was not the first to do this, but one of the first to really theorize how we create meaning and narrative through putting films together. So, up until this point, people were still trying to figure out what is cinema exactly, right? In the 1920s, I'd say 1910s, 1920s, people really began to make arguments for how it's an art and how it's an art that's different from other forms of art, how it's not just filmed theater, for example. And at the same time, it also started to develop as a pretty serious industry, as a way for people to make money, right? So here we see one of the first studios, and you can just see how many different people are involved and continue to be involved in the making of a film that might be different from, if you think about like the writing of a novel, or something like that. You can see there's so much work that's involved, and so many sort of potential stakeholders in the making of a film. And so this tension between cinema as an art, as an entertainment, as an industry, has always been there. And I think it's interesting to think about a film today like Barbie, that just came out, and we have these same kinds of tensions talking about Barbie. Is it art? Is it kind of just an extended commercial? It's directed by this director, Greta Gerwig, who came up as an independent director, independent filmmaker, and has gotten involved and really put her own unique vision into this film, but she's working with kind of very commercial IP, right? So we continue to see these same tensions. And I think a lot of film scholars think about cinema as kind of in these both and terms, right? That it's not an art or an industry, but that it really is both. And some films are more one than the other. Okay, so another kind of historical look at cinema is to think about sort of the many deaths of cinema, how different technologies have disrupted cinema, right? So kind of just briefly go through these, but the first real threat to what kind of cinema purists thought of as cinema was with the introduction of synchronous sound in 1927, with the film The Jazz Singer. Before that, film had oftentimes musical accompaniment or sometimes narration, but not synchronous sound. And people initially reacted, some people initially reacted to the introduction of synchronous sound, kind of in a sense rejecting it, seeing it as maybe a cheap trick, kind of a vulgar addition to cinema, that it took away the essence of the art of cinema. Of course, now we come to expect it. Likewise, with the introduction of Technicolor in the 1930s, this was not the first use of color in cinema, but kind of the first whole scale, and especially we see in a film like The Wizard of Oz, this transition from black and white to color. Again, many cinema purists sort of saw this as a threat to the essence of what they had thought of as cinema. Later on in the 1950s, television became much more popular. People have televisions increasingly in their homes. That became a threat to cinema going out to the movie theater. And I think this is a threat that we continue to discuss with streaming today, right? Why bother going out to the cinema when you can stream something at home? Likewise, in the 1980s, the VCR and VHS tape, and of course, many technologies that came after that, DVD, now streaming. The introduction of digital technologies and digital formats in the 1990s and 2000s kind of created a new sort of crisis for cinema, in that people are asking, right, is a film still a film if it's not shot on film stock, right? Is a digital film still a film, or is it something else? For many viewers, there seems to be very little difference in the viewing experience. And then a maybe non-technology related disruption or possible death of cinema was during the pandemic, right? When a lot of movie theaters had to close. This was a chance for people to develop new streaming habits at home, right? But many people saw this as potentially the death of cinema, the end of cinema. So I bring up all of these examples to kind of contextualize our current moment, the seventh death of cinema that I'm bringing up here today. And that's with something that's happening very close to USD, right, in Los Angeles and in New York, with the WGA and SAG-AFTRA, the Writers Guild and Screen Actors Guild strikes, which are due to several reasons, right, due to compensation, due to working conditions. But I think most interestingly for our discussion today, kind of a response to the producers and studios' threats of using AI to reduce or replace the work done by writers and actors. So we might ask, is this sort of just the latest technological threat to cinema, or is there something that's fundamentally different about this moment, right? And I think a lot of writers and actors see this actually as an existential threat to cinema, maybe something that is fundamentally different. That said, I think, as someone, I sort of come from a global cinema perspective, and I see this very much as a Hollywood-centric discourse, but we can think about a lot of other film industries and filmmakers internationally who might have a chance to get a bit more exposure if there aren't so many Hollywood films competing for screen space. Okay, so third part here, AI and a new cinema. So I want to talk briefly about how AI is already being used in cinema, look at some examples that came up in the reading for today from the MIT Tech Review article, and then talk about the implications of some of this use. So the first use here would be thinking about how is AI already being used? How has it already been used for a little while now in pre-production, in developing films, right? So in terms of developing scripts, it's been used for writing entire scripts, but also writing a draft of a script or writing parts of a script, just as you would use ChatGPT to produce text for any kind of context. It's used for editing and for predicting success. So feeding a script into an algorithm such as that used by Scriptbook here, right? Saying Scriptbook is showing this is the kind of analysis they might give you of a script, telling you about the audience, about the genre, about the likely success of this film. AI is used in a lot of ways to kind of coordinate the work of filmmaking. So to schedule all of the various people involved in a film production, to do location scouting, to figure out what locations might work best for a film. It can be used in casting, right? Rather than casting directors going out or watching a lot of auditions, they can just search a database instead and choose actors that way. So you could imagine for some actors that would be those who are already pretty successful. That might be a nice thing. For others who are trying to get a foot in the door, that might not be so great. And for advertising analytics, right? So again, here AI can be used and data science, right? To suggest, well, these are your target audiences. This is how you might best appeal to those target audiences. Et cetera. So very much useful in the business context in some ways, right? And not without implications. But AI is also being used in filmmaking itself, right? So in CGI, visual effects can make things look more realistic, more surreal. It's being used in music composition for films, being used to create trailers. So an AI model could go and detect what are the most sort of action-packed sequences or emotional moments in the film and identify those to include in a trailer. Notably, AI has been used for voice simulation and alteration in a film or in a series like the Andy Warhol Diaries, where Warhol's voice was brought to life by an AI to narrate his own written diaries, and was also used somewhat controversially in the documentary Roadrunner about Anthony Bourdain, where his voice was brought to life reading an email he had sent to someone, but this was without his consent or really without the director of that documentary disclosing that to the audience. So there's some issues there, I think, kind of as we're entering this new terrain. What do viewers expect? Sort of who owns the rights over their digital likenesses. And from voice, we can also see sort of developments in performance simulation and alteration. So there is discussion, I'm not sure if we can have sort of a fully simulated principal actor, main actor in a film, right? But certainly for background actors, we could scan an actor and use their digital replica, or using digital replicas to create crowd scenes. And then perhaps more notably, it's used in very sort of everyday ways as to de-age certain actors, and the de-aging technologies tend to work best when they're applied to actors, actresses for whom there's a lot of footage over the course of their lifespan. So probably unsurprisingly, this works best for men who don't sort of age out or become discriminated against as they age. And it's very easy to kind of draw this portrait across the life of an actor like Tom Cruise, for example, in order to effectively use this de-aging technologies in more contemporary films. And then also in lip syncing. So if you've ever watched a film with subtitles, sometimes instead of subtitles, you'll have voices dubbed, but there's this perhaps jarring effect where you're watching the lips that don't quite match or don't at all match up with the voice. And so AI technology is now able to change the way that someone's lips move so that it looks like they're actually speaking another language. So all kinds of interesting uses in AI. I thought we'd look at a couple of the examples now from the article. So the frost, and this is maybe the current state of where we are in terms of, can an AI actually make a film, right? So AIs have been doing, text to video production in very minimal ways. The frost was actually used, or actually made using DALL-E 2 to generate images, and then a model called DID to animate those images. And the effect here is really, if any of you are familiar with Game of Thrones, and sort of is kind of like a budget or surreal Game of Thrones. So this is a 12-minute film. Not very interesting narratively, but I think interesting if we're looking at this as an example of like, what can the technology do? How is this new and different? Another example that was cited in the article here, Synthetic Summer. I thought we would watch this one because I just find it to be very funny, but this is a spoof ad made using, I think this was also from Waymark Technologies, but this was, this was from Runway's video making model, and they use Stability AI, which is one of the image generators as well. And you'll see that this sort of spoof beer ad draws on a lot of things you might expect to see in an advertisement for beer, but also has some pretty weird things that happen. So let's see if we can watch this. And let me just make sure I've got sound, video. Okay. Oh, okay. I hope the sound will come through here. I'm going to just try to do this through my own computer.
She was looking kind of down with her finger on her forehead. Stop coming and they don't 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 stop.
Okay, so if you are, oh, sorry about that. If you're able to see that, if you could just drop a word or two in the chat, reaction to that brief clip we just watched. A mess, awesome. Other thoughts? I mean, I think that kind of strange, whack, so weird, unsettling, weird, distorted, uncomfortable. Okay, great, wonderful list here. I felt all of those things as well. Kind of amazed at what's happening, right? I think the AI broke, but also not that impressed, right? That's not going to actually work as a beer advertisement. Kind of really creepy in a lot of ways. I think the article describes it as a horror show. We see the backyard is on fire. People are pouring drinks into these holes that are no longer their mouths, right? Really just kind of a weird thing. So a couple of other ways we might think about the use of AI, or that technologists are thinking about the use of AI in cinema, is with the creation of personalized IP, right? And so this is an example of a company that would turn children's drawings basically into a whole world, or a game, or kind of a cartoon, right? We see this kind of a implication of this in the Netflix series Black Mirror, right, in the Joan is Awful episode, which I would encourage you to watch if you have access to Netflix. But this sort of warning about individualized IP, where these actors were Annie Murphy and Salma Hayek basically sign over the rights to their digital likeness. And this company called Streamberry, which is very clearly kind of an analogy for Netflix, takes all of their personal data, turns it into a show about them that anyone can watch, right? And so it kind of contains very personal information, their thoughts, their texts, their conversations with other people, their conversations with their therapists, right? Those all become part of this show that everyone can see. So this show, I think, really imagines some of the more negative consequences of personalized IP. Is this something that we really want? Is this where we want to go? Okay, and I'll just close with some of the issues with AI use in cinema as we've looked at some of these different new technologies, new uses of these technologies. And I think first and most importantly, thinking about the strike, right, is this possibility of reducing human labor, replacing jobs. And I think it's really interesting in the context of cinema because we talk about AI as the possibilities of AI to replace really boring jobs that no one wants to do, tedious jobs, right? Generally, I would think that screenwriting and acting are some of the most prized jobs, right? A lot of people want to do those jobs. People really derive a lot of satisfaction and enjoyment from those jobs. So why would we want AI to replace those kinds of jobs? I think from the actors, from the writer's perspective, we don't, right? And from the studios who might profit from those replacements or reductions in human labor, you could see their kind of profit incentive there. Another issue, of course, would be the issue of deep fakes, right? We can alter people's lips to look like they're speaking another language or to look like they're saying anything. Issues of consent over people's digital likeness and trust in what we see and hear. And we don't have time to look at this, but I would encourage you to check out Deep Tom Cruise if you're interested in kind of another humorous example of how deep fake technologies have been used on an actor for whom there's a lot of footage out there to play with. I think personally, sort of the disappointing quality of the output is an issue that we might consider, right? That just in terms of holding technology companies accountable for they're saying these new technologies are going to revolutionize everything. They're going to make, right, personalized IP that will be so much better than anything we can watch. I don't know. I think currently I'm somewhat disappointed with the output, and I'm not sure that I want to see more of that. Something that we don't often talk about, but I think the environmental impact of all of this computing and the data centers that are required to carry out this computing, they require a lot of fresh water to keep them cool. So computing does have a very significant environmental impact. Not that Hollywood is sort of a star in terms of green practices. But just thinking that AI does also have this environmental impact that we should be thinking about. And then finally, an issue with AI use in cinema, and I put an asterisk here because I'm not sure if this is so much of a problematic issue, but the possibility of model collapse, right? That's this idea that as AI generated content kind of continues to feed AI models, that the model will eventually collapse. It will just be so full of junk, right? And so this might be a way that you could see hackers or kind of the modern day Luddites would go into trying to destroy AI. And then you also see, I think, pushback from a lot of artists and creators with hashtags such as human art, art by humans, no AI, right? To insist on they're still making work themselves and putting their work out there, putting their work on the internet and insisting that this is work that they made themselves and without the assistance of AI. So anyway, just all things that we might consider so that we don't end up in a future where we're sitting at movies watching credits such as these. And I'll be happy to talk about any of this as well as other implications in the discussion sections. So thank you, and I will pass this on to my colleague, Eliza Smith, Dr. Smith.
So you all are already hopefully familiar with me. I'm Professor Smith. I teach French language and literature classes and content classes in the Department of Languages, Cultures, and Literatures. And today I'll be talking about Anatomical Venus and Uncanny Valley in Monsieur Venus and Les Yeux sans visage. Oops. Okay, so before we delve into our analysis, I want to sort of look at three main aspects that you all should think about as we're discussing this novel, this French novel written at the end of the 19th century, and a French horror film that came out in 1960. So the first aspect of this is thinking about the human fascination with the artificial in general. So when we talk about AI, there's definitely that element present, but as a human condition, what draws us to the artificial as a species? The second element would be the intersection of the artificial with nature, and specifically as it pertains to the arts. So today I'll be talking about a novel and a film, but you can think about it in music or visual arts, dance, theater, etc. The ways in which it manifests in these different disciplines and throughout history, right? And finally, the third aspect of this is sort of the human need to create a figure made in our image. And we see that with AI today. And this is known also as the Pygmalion effect after the Greek myth. And as we saw with Dr. Blazer's talk, it's not just a physical resemblance to humans. We're talking about a mental resemblance, an emotional resemblance. So there's all of these complexities that go into this as we seek to make something that is human-like. And I put some examples down there from literature, from different eras. And so we can look at Pygmalion back in the 9th century about a sculptor who is sort of disillusioned with the women that are surrounding him. And so he decides to make the perfect woman and falls in love with his work of art. We have Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And as you all heard last week with Dr. Asaro's talk, Pinocchio would be an example of this. So looking at these three sort of aspects in the novel and the film I'll talk about today. So when we talk about resembling the human, we see this a lot in science fiction as a genre and contemporary cinema and TV. We see it in the media. We saw that with Dr. Wenzel's talk in week 1, these headlines, will AI evolve? Will it surpass us? Will it take over? All of these things manifest it in different realms as we're talking about creating things that are human-like. And so there are different categories of robots, for example, humanoids, for example. We see C-3PO from Star Wars, which would be a robot that has a human structure, but doesn't have an external form that looks like a human. Whereas an android, like the Terminator was the example I picked, would have both an external form that aesthetically looks like a human, as well as a structure that is human-like. And interestingly enough, the modern use of this term comes from a French novel written in the late 19th century called Future Eve or Le Futur. So what's something you can all think about is the ways in which these sort of ideas that have to do with AI are sketched out years before in creative works before they actually come to fruition as actual technologies. So you all had an article on Anatomical Venus, which is where we'll start today. We'll go back to the 18th century in Florence, Italy, and we have Clemente Susini's Anatomical Venus in the late 18th century, the first one of which he named Medici Venus. And so what this was simply a life-size dissectable wax woman with glass eyes and human hair. And the purpose of this wax woman was to teach human anatomy, okay? And so you could disassemble it into 7 anatomically correct layers. And in the last layer, you would have always a fetus, which you can kind of see in this image on the left, but I'll show you another set of images where you have a better shot of the different layers. It was remarkably accurate. And what it kind of did was shift this connotation from the use of corpses for medical dissection and learning about the human body to this allusion to Venus, the goddess of the Greek goddess of beauty and love and desire and sex. So it kind of, for using this very almost grotesque thing when delving into medicine, they sort of shifted it to almost this art-like figure. And so we have this embodiment between the relationship amongst art, science, and even metaphysics. So wax as a material, interestingly enough, is very similar to the appearance of human flesh. And so this was not something that they just started using in the late 18th century as a means of sculpting realistic human-like figures, but was actually something they were using in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance to create effigies or wax figures that they would offer up on an altar in a religious setting. Oops. So as we will see, this anatomical Venus, is a perfect example of the uncanny, which is what we'll look at today. So here we go. Okay, so here are some more images I took from a book that I own. And yet, as you'll see on this left-hand side, the organs in the background that are made of wax, but then in the middle, we have the three women anatomical Venuses that are in these glass display cases. And then on the right, you have a kind of an aerial shot of the inside, and you can see the fetus that is there. Okay, so we're going to be sort of framing our analysis through the lens of the uncanny. And we're going to start first with Freud's definition of the uncanny. So you may be already familiar with Sigmund Freud. He's the father of psychoanalysis. And at the beginning of the 20th century, he penned an essay called The Uncanny. And for Freud, this was an aesthetic investigation, but probably not the aesthetic investigation you might imagine. Typically, when we hear the word aesthetic, we think of the beautiful, the sublime, all of these really wonderful things. But what Freud was interested in investigating was actually the feelings of repulsion or fear or uneasiness that are sometimes veiled by these feelings of beauty and sublime. And so for Freud, the uncanny exists in the realm of the frightening, that which evokes fear and dread, but it's not what we would typically think as evoking fear. So typically when we have a fear response, it's something that has to do with the unknown. But in the case of the uncanny, according to Freud, it would be something that's actually very ordinary, very everyday, okay? And so he actually signals that other writers and philosophers have noted certain things that evoke this response: dolls, waxwork figures, robots, things of that nature. And he looks at it in relation to a text actually by a German author, E.T.A. Hoffmann's The Sandman. Okay, so he sort of analyzes this concept within a work of literature as well. Building on this idea of the uncanny, this brings us to the concept of the uncanny valley. And I saw that someone threw that into the chat when looking at that commercial that was AI generated. So you all are probably much more familiar with this, being more technologically savvy and sort of the generation that grew up with all of this technology. So in 1970, a Japanese roboticist, Masahiro Mori, he developed this theory in relation to robots, in relation to AI. And so he noticed two things. The first thing he noticed is that robots who were built for industry, that were purely functional, they did not have, they didn't evoke a strong affinity from us humans, okay? They were simply just machines carrying out a task. Whereas in the context of toy robots or artificial humans who actually externally looked like us, like human-like, we had a higher affinity for these kinds of robots because they resembled us. However, in this sort of quest to create robots in our likeness externally, Maury noticed that at a certain point, there's actually a dip in the affinity, okay? As the likeness increases, all of a sudden there will be kind of a valley that forms. And he posits this as there's sort of a, it's not quite human, it can't quite be pulled off. So it becomes so close to being human that it actually provokes a feeling of sort of, we become unsettled by it. And the example he gives is actually a prosthetic hand. So if you shake someone's hand, the prosthetic hand may look like a real human hand, but only upon touching it or someone telling you that it's fake, a sense of uncomfortability might come over you because, you know, you realize, oh, this is actually not a human hand. There's something kind of off about it, okay? It doesn't have the warmth or the texture maybe fully or what have you. He also posits that movement can affect our affinity. Okay, so either we have a higher affinity or lower affinity. And one of the things he talks about is smiling. So smiling is a natural human response. And when we see another person smile, it kind of evokes a joy and happiness within us. However, he states that if you program a smile and, for example, in a robot, if it's too slow, it'll actually be very unsettling and look kind of creepy. So that's another aspect to this uncanny valley. So these are two graphs that are included in the translation and the original essay. And I'm going to focus on the one on the right here. You see on the y-axis this affinity that either goes up or down, that's our affinity. And then on the x-axis, like the human likeness. So how closely something physically resembles a human. So the dashed line here is for objects that actually move. So you'll see an industrial robot is pretty low, humanoid, but then all of a sudden we have this dip. So right here is where the uncanny valley exists. So at the very bottom, something like a zombie. Okay, it's human-like, but there's something off about it that is very unsettling to us. It's not quite human. And as we come up out of the valley, you might see something like a myoelectric hand, a puppet that moves. Even a sick person might reside in uncanny valley. And then as we come out of uncanny valley, we would have a healthy human. The solid line here is for inanimate objects. So a stuffed animal is not an uncanny valley, whereas something like a corpse would be at the very base of uncanny valley. And so Mori posits that this exists within our brains. It registers as kind of unsettling because as the entities become more human-like, they almost start to resemble elements of a corpse, okay? And there's something in our brains that register this and kind of evoke within us our own inherent fears of death. So his solution is actually we shouldn't strive to make things look more human-like. We should actually pursue a non-human design to avoid this uncanny valley. And so here are some examples. CGI, as was mentioned, okay, Polar Express, you all were probably born around this time, but when this movie came out, the media went crazy because the figures just didn't look quite right. They looked kind of creepy, even though this was supposed to be a children's film. You all know this too from social media, the, photoshopping and the face tuning and filters. When people go overboard, there's something kind of off about it. This is an example from what Mori was talking about with androids. Okay, they just don't look quite human. And finally, Mori puts on the graph sick humans, but we also see this nowadays with extreme body modification or extreme plastic surgery, where people distort their features so much they just don't look quite human-like. They look like an alien or other zombie, something of that nature. So we're going to be looking at one novel and one film, and I want you to sort of think about these three aspects. So the relationship between the artificial and the human or the natural, this element of the uncanny, what sort of evokes this not quite humanness, this uneasiness within us, and then finally, the sort of fine line between the grotesque and innovation. So the first novel, the novel I'm going to talk about is Monsieur Venus. This is my sort of realm of specialty. I'm a 19th century scholar. And this novel was written by a woman whose pen name was Rachid. The novel is part of the decadent movement. And this was an artistic movement that really prioritized and valued excess, artificiality, all these things, okay? And the text basically showcases a very violent love between Raoul, who is an upper class dominant woman. Okay, she's very atypical for the time, very much independent, masculine-like in that sense. And Jacques, who's working class, so he's lower on the class hierarchy, and he's very much this sort of androgynous figure. He's a florist. And at the time, and you'll see why in the next couple slides, this text was deemed pornographic by critics and was actually banned in France. So some of the major themes, we obviously have this possession and power theme when it comes to love relations, but there's also the theme of artifice versus nature, this kind of tension that exists, the exploration of identity, and that certainly has to pertain to the inversion of gender roles, which was very provocative for the time. So over the course of the novel, Raoul, she basically transforms Jacques into her more feminized lover. So he goes from being kind of this androgynous figure to being more and more woman-like, and almost to the point at times where you can't tell who's talking about who, So you have to pay a lot of attention to the context. At the same time, throughout the novel, Raoul, she has another suitor, the Baron de Haitob, who's sort of the opposite of Jacques. He's this very hyper-masculine military figure, very conventionally masculine for the time. And near the end of the novel, we have a scene where Jacques actually tries to seduce de Haitob, okay? And that provokes Raoul's jealousy. She becomes insanely jealous, and her solution is to organize a duel between the two men. But it's not a duel between winner and loser, but a duel to the death, and ultimately Jacques is killed, sadly. So this brings us to the last two paragraphs of the novel, and I want you to think about the feeling of uncanny that might be stirred within you as a listener or a reader, but also the elements of the artificial and those of the natural world, okay? And so at the very end of the novel, Rachilde, she brings us to Raoul's apartment in Paris into a blue room. And I'm just going to read quickly this description, and you can all listen along. This bedroom is completely blue, like a sky without clouds. On the couch in the form of a shell, guarded by a marble statue of Eros, sits a wax mannequin covered with a transparent rubber epidermis. The red hair, blonde eyelashes, golden chest hairs are natural. The teeth that decorate the mouth, the nails on the hands and feet have been torn from a cadaver. The enamel eyes have an adorable gaze. The walled bedroom has a hidden door behind a wall covering in the bathroom. At night, a woman dressed in mourning attire and sometimes a young man in black clothing open the door. They come to kneel near the bed, and when they have contemplated the marvelous forms of the wax statue, they hug it and kiss it on the lips. A mechanical spring placed inside the sides corresponds to the mouth and makes it animate at the same time as it makes the thighs move apart. The mannequin, a masterpiece of anatomy, was made by a German. So at the very end here, we have this wax mannequin made of Jacques. He is dead at this point, so this is just something made in his likeness, and it's a mix of artificial materials, the wax, the enamel eyes, and actual body parts taken from Jacques' corpse, his hair, his teeth, his nails, things like that, okay? So there's sort of two things going on. On the one hand, he becomes this object of beauty and veneration. We have this like secret altar in Raoul's apartment, and this sort of ritualized aspect around visiting him. Her and de Haitob kind of arrive wearing black, and they sort of kneel at it as if it's, you know, again, an altar of some kind. We have sort of references to Botticelli's The Birth of Venus with the shelled couch and the blue sky, that very famous painting, as well as explicit mention of Eros, the Greek god of love. At the same time, there's this very grotesque element within the story, right? This sort of uncanny element. It's a wax figure that contains within the sides, so the sides of the thighs, this mechanical spring, so that when they kiss the wax figure, the thighs open in this very explicit sexual act, okay? And it's a direct reference, suggestion of necrophilia. And you can see why it was banned at the time, okay? Very disturbing. So even though there's this sort of innovation that's present, it's definitely eclipsed by the intention, which is to sexually objectify this like fake body, this wax body of Jacques. So when thinking about the sort of anatomical Venus from the 18th century, we have this transformation of Jacques' corpse into this mechanical body made of wax and human elements, but you can see at the base of Maury's graph, you know, you'd have something like a myoelectric hand. I'm imagining that would be, you know, Jacques' mechanical wax figure would be somewhere near the base if we were to think about the uncanny. And even as readers, we get kind of disturbed reading that passage. It's a very weird end of the novel, right? And so like I mentioned, you know, we have innovation on the one hand, but it completely gets erased because of these, you know, perverse, grotesque intentions. Okay, and to wrap up quickly, I know I talk really fast and I have a lot of information here. I want to sort of shift 75 years later to a French horror film entitled Les Yeux sans visage, which is based on a French novel of the same name. And I think you already all have some familiarity, even indirectly, with this film, because in 1983, Billy Idol wrote a song inspired by the film called Eyes Without a Face, which is the direct English translation. But I think you all know it as the viral TikTok song. So I'm just going to play a little bit for you. Okay, so you're all probably very familiar with that sound. Oops. as it, has been circulating on TikTok the past couple months. So quickly, just to give you all a synopsis of the film, it is a horror film. It centers on Dr. Génissier, who keeps his teenage daughter, Christiane, hidden inside his mansion. And so we discover that her face has been pretty much ripped off, like horribly disfigured by a car accident. Her father was driving the car, so it was, his fault in that way. But Christiane is forced to wear a mask at all times, whether she's inside or outside in their garden. So unbeknownst to Christiane, her father, Dr. Génissier, and his assistant Louise are actually kidnapping young women, they're anesthetizing them, and then they're performing non-consensual surgeries on them in a secret lab in the basement of the mansion, okay? And what they're doing is they're removing the faces of these young women and performing these face transplants onto Christiane to sort of restore her humanness, to restore her beauty, okay? And typically the victims die from these procedures because Christiane's body inevitably rejects the new skin and it starts to decompose, okay? So similar to Monsieur Venus, there's also a great twist, but I won't give that away. I hope you all watch this film. At the very end of the film, or throughout the film rather, we have elements of medical innovation, certainly with the face transplant, and I will show you a clip of that scene in the next slide, in the next couple slides. And just like Monsieur Venus, we have sort of this desire to restore a humanness. So with Jacques' wax figure, it was sort of this likeness of Jacques to restore Jacques as a person in some way. And with Christiane, it's this desire to restore the physical human qualities. But inevitably, it's not successful. Okay, we have necrosis that occurs. And so we're definitely in the realm of the uncanny as viewers. There's something very uncomfortable about it. And we see this a lot in horror in general as a genre. And just briefly, so as an example, there are sort of 3 versions of Christiane's face that we see that evoke that, kind of exist in the realm of the uncanny valley. The first is her necrosis, and I have a clip of this scene, but I don't think I'm going to play it for time, but I'll certainly play it for those of you in my discussion section later. But her skin starts to decompose and they actually show it. But we can see that she doesn't look fully human there. Okay, there's something kind of perverted about her face. In the bottom right, we see Christiane's eyes without a face. So this is the only shot in the movie where we actually see what her face looks like. So this is her disfigured face in the bottom right. She looks almost like a zombie. There's nothing human about her, and it's quite disturbing. And then on the left, the bottom left, we have Christiane's mask that she's forced to wear. So as you can see, there are nose holes and eye holes. The mouth is sealed and doesn't move. There are no eyebrows or any kind of dimensions to the mask. And there's something very unsettling about it and creepy. Okay, so just to wrap up, I'm going to conclude after this. I want to show you, I'm not going to show you the necrosis scene, but I want to show you the surgery scene. It is fake. It's very graphic. It's movie magic, but if you feel uncomfortable, feel free not to watch. And I want you to think about sort of what we've been talking about, this, the relationship between the artificial and nature, but also innovation that's in there, and how it can quickly turn into the grotesque or into horror. Oops, my bad. Okay, so let me get this started. Here we go. Okay, so that's probably like the most graphic scene in the whole movie, but that's when they're actually, removing the face of a young woman to put onto Christiane's face. And so to conclude in all of this, I want you to think about, I know we can't really talk about AI before 1950, but we can talk about the sort of complex human desires that exist behind AI, and that, you know, we can see emerge in the field of AI, specifically, you know, the extension of the human, you know, entities made in the likeness of humans, and sort of this fascination we have with the relationship between the artificial and nature. Okay, and you can think about the question, how have these desires and fascinations manifested in the arts specifically over the centuries? So, you know, with the text about the android, for example, that was something that was in the air before we could even invent an android. So, you know, you've all gone from the anatomical Venus to this, like, you know, face transplant plastic surgery in these two works. But I want you all to think about the arts as not only just an exploration of the human condition, but also of possibility. And that can be of, you know, the dark consequences that accompany some of these innovations and technologies, but it can also be a great platform for creativity, and one that we really need vis-a-vis technology and progress. So with that, I will conclude, and thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I'm going to have some interesting dreams tonight now. And thanks to our entire panel, really fascinating talks. And I think we both covered a lot of ground, and yet we have so many points of where these different talks come together.